Thank y'all very much for coming today. I'm Roger Duncan. It is my honor to introduce our speaker for today. Before doing that, I wanted to tell you about next week's speaker. We will be hearing Colin Meehan, who is the Director of Regulatory and Public Affairs at First Solar. He'll be speaking on power markets, regulation, and utility scale solar in the U.S. So please join us for that. Today's speaker is Elizabeth Stein. Elizabeth is a senior attorney for the Environmental Defense Fund. She is in New York as part of the EDF's Clean Energy Project. I have worked and talked with Elizabeth for many years on this and other projects. She's going to speak to us today about the New York REV, and you heard mention of that in our previous speaker very briefly. The New York Reforming the Energy Vision is generally considered the cutting edge of utility regulation reform going on in the country today. Elizabeth has led the team from Environmental Defense Fund in dealing with and interacting with the REV process. She's been at the table with the utilities and the regulators and the environmentalists and the different stakeholders in the process, and she's going to give us some insight into how that cutting edge experiment, if you will, is going. Elizabeth?
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Roger, for inviting me. I'm really honored to be doing this. And realizing and staring at the title of my slide that actually I think it's renewing the energy vision and that I mistyped it here. So I apologize. REV. Everyone just calls it REV. So I'd like to start by giving a background to sort of New York's electric system generally, which I think is necessary to sort of put REV in context. New York is a restructured state, which means that the utilities have been made to divest of their generation assets. So the utility monopoly is just the the distribution grid. We have New York ISO, which is a single state ISO. It's sort of similar to ERCOT, but unlike ERCOT, it is FERC jurisdictional. New York is a founding member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also known as RGGI. And this matters because since 2008, our generation actually has been internalizing price of carbon using a cap and trade system. Typically, the price has been coming out at about $5 a ton. We can compare this to the damage cost of carbon that the Federal Interagency Working Group has found to be about $40 a ton, and that will be important later in my talk. Because of the FERC and RGGI overlays, our PSC is a little constrained in its ability to unilaterally shape the energy industry, or the electric industry here in New York, or in New York. We have 6 investor-owned utilities that provide most of the electric service. The largest of these is Con Edison. Con Edison serves what we call the downstate, or most of what we call the downstate region, which is New York City and the neighboring county of Westchester. Most of the load is in Con Ed's service territory, but most of the generation is elsewhere in the state. The Public Service Commission is part of the Department of Public Service. The other part of the Department of Public Service is its staff, which supports the Commission's work both on routine matters and also on extraordinary things like REV. So REV is part of this, as you know, national, or you may not know, there's sort of a national conversation emerging about the future of the utility business model, sort of a sense that we may want something pretty different from our electric system in the future than what we've wanted before. But in New York, there's been some local drivers that have been really important and are a little different from what I think have been driving the conversation elsewhere. So this is Lower Manhattan after Superstorm Sandy. And let's see if I can figure out how this works. Yeah, so this is about 40th Street. The huge blackout that hit Manhattan in Superstorm Sandy was primarily below 40th Street. This here, I'm guessing, is that's about where the NYU campus should be. It became one of the huge Sandy success stories. This area I actually think is served by a different substation. I don't think that's a distributed generation area. But the NYU campus had an on-site clean combined heat and power plant and a microgrid that kept it up and running, and it became a huge resource for everyone below 40th Street when this happened. This is probably about 14th Street, which is where a substation along the East River was inundated in the storm surge. We call it Superstorm Sandy because we couldn't call it Hurricane Sandy by the time it got to us because the winds had actually died down mostly. It was no longer hurricane force winds. But this was devastating. It was probably one of the two most devastating storms ever to hit New York City. And I think the fact that it was a storm surge that did all the damage, and it wasn't just the electric system, it did all kinds of damage. I think the fact that it was the storm surge had a big impact on the conversation about global warming, because it was literally rising sea inundating Manhattan, and inundating not just Manhattan, but up and down the coastline, inundating everything. We had subway tunnels full of water that were unusable for a long time, car tunnels full of water, streets, houses wiped away. I think that really changed the conversation. It provided a preview kind of what warmer temperatures and higher sea levels could mean for us. But it wasn't just Sandy. This slide shows the 10 most significant weather-related power disruptions ever in the history of Con Ed. The main point to notice is that 5 of the 10 happened between 2010 and 2012. The biggest one by far is Sandy, but Irene actually is a little understated in terms of its impact on the state because it was mostly an upstate event. It had some impact on the city, but it was mostly upstate riverine flooding. So from the perspective of the state, we had this 1-2 punch of Hurricane Irene battering the upstate, and actually people in the city viewed Hurricane Irene as having fizzled out. They got these warnings of this huge storm, and then they felt like nothing had happened. Which is why then people went and ignored evacuation warnings when Sandy came along. So that was kind of interesting. So this whole series of events really, I think, both raised consciousness about what more extreme weather and rising sea levels could mean, and really introduced an interest in what distributed energy resources might mean in an area, in a period of a lot of climate-related system disruption. So shortly after Hurricane Sandy, very soon after, the governor instituted some commissions to study our climate readiness, and one of them was the 2100 Commission, NYS 2100 Commission. Fred Krupp sat on that commission. He's the president of EDF, and that commission eventually came out with this very forward-thinking report in January of 2013, just a few months after Sandy, that talked about immediate investment to transition the grid to a flexible system that can respond to future technologies, support clean energy integration, and minimize outages during major storms and events. And we felt great about this vision. It sounded like what we wanted to see. And the same month, we found out how little a single report out of a temporary commission actually means. Because that month, Con Ed filed a general rate case. And Con Ed, of course, had just been battered by Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, and the various things that came before it. And that rate case was basically a completely traditional rate case, plus some stuff about storm hardening thrown in to the tune of $1 billion. And a lot of that storm hardening was stuff that they had been, realizing they needed for some time leading up to Sandy. Some of it had to do with things that were brought to their attention by Sandy, but nothing that would have laid the groundwork for a more flexible system, none of that stuff about supporting clean energy integration, et cetera. EDF intervened in that case, hoping to bring those kinds of issues to light, and it was very much an uphill battle, and because we were really fighting the business model. You know, we weren't looking for changes around the edges of the rate case. We were really looking for things to work completely differently. What we discovered was that while we were fighting this uphill battle in the rate case, there really was the groundwork for real change being laid at our state commission outside the rate case on a different track. We had, the governor appointed a new chair to the Public Service Commission, Audrey Zibelman, who had come out of 25 years in the electric sector, both on the public and private side. She'd been the founder and president of a company called Veridity Energy, Inc., which was sort of a cutting-edge smart power kind of entity. And we saw this as a hopeful sign that maybe change was coming in New York. And then we started hearing rumors of what everyone was then calling a Utility 2.0 proceeding. And in fact, we started to hear in the rate case, people telling us on the sly, you really should be you should be holding fire on these till we get to the Utility 2.0, because that's where these things are really going to happen. And it all sort of remained a bunch of rumor until the last week of 2013. After Christmas, an order came out in proceeding concerning some energy efficiency surcharges, the EAPS program, the Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard. And I'm going to read you 3 short quotes from that, because that order has been kind of forgotten, but I actually think that the way that they presaged the REV proceeding at that time really anticipated everything, or a lot of what has happened since then. They said, the Commission and other policymakers can no longer afford to think of energy efficiency and distributed clean energy resources as peripheral elements of the electric system that require continuous government support. Rather, the time has come to manage the capabilities of these customer-based technologies as a core source of value to electric customers. So that's the first one. Second, we observe that even the best designed clean energy programs will not succeed in their essential purposes if the regulatory regime and market design within which they operate inhibit rather than promote their success. As one of our own esteemed regulators, the late Alfred Kahn, observed, all regulation is incentive regulation. And the last quote was, we conclude that the time has arrived for a fundamental refocus of not only system benefit programs, which are these programs funded by surcharges, but also comprehensive consideration of how our regulatory paradigm and the retail and wholesale market designs either effectuate or impede progress of our policy objectives underlying these programs. So they came out with this pronouncement, and 4 months later, in April 2014, the REV proceeding actually got started. And there were, from the start, going to be 2 tracks. The first track was basically the vision. What will this new marketplace look like? What are we actually asking of the utility company? Or what do we want the industry to start looking like? And track 2 was what they called the regulatory and rate-making track. And that had to do more with how do we regulate the utilities to make sure that they behave in a manner that's consistent with that future. And also at the very beginning of the proceeding is when, even before the tracks got started, we first started to hear of something called the distributed system platform. And I'm just going to use a quote about this also. That was to be a flexible platform for new energy products and services to improve overall system efficiency and to better serve customer needs, and that the entity operating that platform would be charged with creating markets, tariffs, and operational systems to enable behind-the-meter resource providers to monetize products and services that will provide value to the utility system and thus to all customers. So a lot went on in track 1. I'm going to go straight to some of the decisions that came out of track 1. Probably the biggest, or one of the biggest questions in track 1 was who should be this platform provider? And in particular, staff had proposed that maybe it should be the distribution utilities, but there were some other ideas that were floated. And a lot of concern about the distribution utilities being given that responsibility for various reasons. The outcome was that they would serve as DSPs, but that they would do so, I didn't put this in the slide, but that they would do so subject to satisfactory performance. And we never have gotten direction on what that actually means. One of the objections that was raised when there was talk of giving them that responsibility was that it would result in a fragmented marketplace. And the commission sort of answered that, or I think attempted to answer that, by saying that the various DSPs should form a single statewide platform. They would have to coordinate together. The other big track one question, which was in play, you need to remember at the same time as who is the DSP was in play, was should the utilities be able to own distributed energy resources? And mostly the resources they think they had in mind at that point was mostly generation, also potentially storage. And this was a big question and remains, I think, kind of a question. Yes?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Are your distribution system providers also the retailers, or is the retail unbundled from that?
Yeah, so because we're restructured, generation is spun off, and the energy commodity is sold by different entities. The utilities do sell energy as a sort of provider of last resort, but they are not in that the revenues they get from selling energy they receive on a pass-through basis. They're not allowed to be profiting on selling energy. I think what you may be asking about is, I know in Texas you actually have retailers that are separate from generators, and we have a slightly different system, but our entities, oddly enough, they call them ESCOs, our energy suppliers, the entities that you would actually buy energy from if you're buying it from someone other than the distribution utility.
And is the majority of the energy sold by the incumbent or these competitors?
I think that the commercial and industrial customers have largely fled, especially the large ones have almost entirely fled. Something like 97%, in the Con Ed service territory, I know that something like 97% of those who were subject to mandatory hourly pricing, which is pricing of the energy commodity based on, I think, day-ahead pricing in the wholesale energy market, 97% or something of those customers have fled to ESCOs, apparently partly because of concern about the volatility. I don't know the number for the residentials. I think it's considerably lower. And there's been a widespread perception that this whole construct hasn't worked for our residential market, and that actually residential customers who have switched to ESCOs in many cases, and possibly most cases, have seen higher prices than they would have if they had stuck with the distribution utility as sort of provider of last resort. And there's been, and I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but there's actually, mostly because I haven't been working on it very closely, so I can't describe it in detail, but there's actually been like an investigation underway of all the ESCOs that culminated in what they called a reset order back in, I think, February of this year, where they attempted to basically make all the ESCOs start over from scratch and not sell to residential, at least on the residential side, and not sell to residential customers unless they could guarantee lower prices or were selling some kind of a clean energy product. And I think the status of that is it's currently been, that reset has been stayed by a court, but I'm not sure. It's definitely being litigated. And it's been an ugly scene. So the ownership of DERs. So since they don't own regular generation, there's the question of whether they could own the distributed generation. And there was some desire on the part of, I think, staff, certainly evinced it in the proposal. There were some parties that were somewhat sympathetic to it. The utilities themselves really wanted it for the answer to be yes, that they could own distributed energy resources. And part of the reason, I think, is that there is concern that in a distributed future, one of the traits of a distributed future, we'll talk about it a little more as I proceed, but that you would want to build up the distribution system less and rely, instead of relying on having lots of grid infrastructure, to some extent you rely on these in the alternative. And since utilities traditionally make their profits from capital investments in infrastructure, there seems to be a lot of lost opportunity in a high distributed resources future. And so one thought on how you could make up that opportunity is if they had a lot of opportunity involving the DERs themselves. But the commission went with a presumption against DER ownership. And I think that the test that they set out, I wasn't going to go into it in detail, but it came up when I gave a similar talk earlier, so I'll just mention it in brief. There is a particular project that I'll talk a little more about in a few slides involving a specific area of the Con Ed system where there are system needs and they're trying to meet them with DER, and it happens to be a very difficult to serve, very a lot of low-income customers, et cetera, community. So I think that the test for do you want the utility to be able to own some of these resources was partly shaped by that particular experiment that was then in progress. I am, yeah. So the resulting construct where you have incumbent utilities serving as the DSP, the platform provider, but not owning the generation, it's sort of similar to to what goes on in the bulk power system where you have a platform provider that doesn't own the generation, but there is a potential conflict that doesn't exist at the bulk power level because they also do own the grid infrastructure, which the RTOs don't. So the RTOs are also nonprofit, so they're not looking to profit anyway. The utilities are for-profit entities, and the way they make their money traditionally is on that grid infrastructure. So there's a potential conflict between the grid infrastructure that's their bread and butter and the distributed future. So these were the very big key takeaways from track one. But the other thing that came out of track one was a very long list of tasks. And this is just the beginning of that long list of tasks. And I'm not going to go into all of them. But this went on for a couple of pages. And in general, REV has operated that way, that there's been, it's had tentacles going in all sorts of directions all the time. There's been a lot of spin-off from everything. So yeah?
What is ETIP?
Oh, is that there? Oh, yeah. The Energy Efficiency Transition Implementation Plan, which were plans for transitioning their energy efficiency programs to more like what was envisioned in the REV future. And this is happening, that was sort of came out of REV Track 1, but there's all these other proceedings like the EEPs that I mentioned before with that late 2013 order, et cetera, et cetera. And the ETIPs really relate to some extent more closely to that than to REV. But you're right, here it is in this list. So some of what happened as a result of track one, which some of which was direct result or less direct, one thing that happened is the benefit cost analysis framework, the BCA framework, which was developed to help shape how utilities approach certain decisions, specifically relating to the REV transformation. And the framework itself was ultimately issued in January of this year after a long period of comment. And from my perspective, and my team's perspective, what we got really excited about when the BCA framework came out is that it does adopt the social cost of carbon, that larger number, as the proper measure of the value of an avoided ton of carbon dioxide emissions. And for directing how to use it, they adjust it for the amount that's already internalized by RGGI. But the principle that you should care when you're making a decision about the full damage associated with a ton of carbon was embraced in this order. So advanced metering infrastructure, another thing, well, this is something that was a little less directly out of the order, but I think clearly wouldn't have happened without the order and without REV. So there's a lot of talk in both the track 1 and track 2 orders about granular pricing and meaningful price signals. And yet going into REV, and even for most of the course of REV, and in fact now, we don't have advanced metering infrastructure in New York. We're actually definitely behind the curve nationally. We didn't go installing a lot of, or any AMI when a lot of other states were doing it using Recovery Act money. And in the 2013 rate case, when we had come in and tried to make an issue of, the lack of flexibility on the system, it didn't go anywhere. But in early 2015, Con Ed filed a new rate case because they'd only gotten a 2-year settlement the last time, and it called for a full AMI deployment, and it was clearly based on what they thought their responsibilities were going to be in a REV future, at least based in part on that. And that case did not become a full-blown rate case. It actually got settled by agreeing to extend the old rate plan a year. But the agreement that did that kept the AMI issue alive and had them continue to develop an AMI business plan in a collaborative setting. And we participated pretty actively in that. And the resulting business plan and the order that confirmed it authorized Con Ed to undertake a full AMI deployment system-wide, tries to bake in learnings from the fact that we are a late actor. You know, we can learn from what has not necessarily gone so well elsewhere. And among the major things that there's a perception didn't really happen, there's a perception that the AMI that's been deployed elsewhere often served the utility interests but didn't necessarily meet customer or market interests. So the AMI order makes sure that data from these meters is going to become available very, very quickly, like as close as possible to immediately, to customers and their authorized third parties. And it also requires Con Ed to begin piloting innovative rates using the information that's available from AMI almost immediately. So we actually got to start talking with them about what a really compelling rate pilot would look like in the course of that collaborative proceeding. And later, and I'll mention the DSIP order in a minute, but when the Distributed System Implementation Plan order came out, it actually built on the Con Ed AMI order. It came out about a month later, and it basically said a lot of that stuff that we told Con Ed about their rate plan, about their AMI rollout, you know, other utilities, if you want to propose AMI rollouts, you know, that's going to cover you too. We want those things from you too. So there we have it, the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. As already mentioned, it didn't come out of REV. It was sort of a pre-herald of REV. It came out of the 2013 rate case. There was to have been, or the utility would like to have had, a $1.2 billion substation upgrade. And if that sounds outlandish, if anyone's familiar with how much substation upgrades normally cost, in New York, because our substations are underground and it's so built up, and the underground network system is very complicated, substation upgrades are just a lot more expensive than they would be anywhere else. So the utility had proposed a $1.2 billion substation upgrade, but in the settlement agreement agreed to pursue non-traditional alternatives instead of that in a collaborative setting. That project actually has had some pretty interesting outcomes in terms of really revolutionizing the way that anyone does energy efficiency in a targeted area. And I just want to read you a quick quote from the Q2 2016 update of this project, that they had contracted for 12 megawatts of load relief at the peak hour through installation of energy efficiency measures at over 5,000 small businesses and 1,400 multifamily buildings, which include more than 9,300 apartments. So there's this phenomenal number of players being reached through this. And in the track 1 order, they ordered all the utilities to find their own non-wires alternatives projects that would proceed on a similar pathway. And finally, there's the Distributed System Implementation Plan that I mentioned a minute ago as making a bunch of the AMI requirements incumbent on all the other utilities if they want to do AMI. The DSIP is sort of a twofold document. As the name suggests, it's a plan for implementing, the DSP function is sort of a whole new function for utilities. It's different from generation, transmission, and distribution. It's kind of this fourth thing that they could do. And it's basically, in part, a plan for how are you going to do that. But the same document is also meant to provide information to the marketplace about where the system needs are so that parties can actually begin planning DER opportunities, getting a sense of what the market opportunity is. The guidance for what should actually be in the DSIPs was not completed until April of this year, and the initial DSIPs were filed 2 months later in June, which was pretty quick. There's a lot of parties think that the initial DSIP, including DER providers, are concerned that the initial DSIPs don't actually provide the level of information they would need to see what the DER opportunities are and make real proposals. And we don't yet know whether that's going to lead to any remedial action. What the DSIP guidance called for, and I think this was also heralded in the Track 1 order in the first place, was that there would be 2 rounds of this. There's the initial DSIPs, which came out in June, which are filed individually by the utilities, and then there's going to be a joint DSIP that's sort of working toward that single statewide platform, and that's actually due next week. So moving along with that. So I'm going to go on to Track 2 outcomes, even though there's all these other tentacles that I'm talking about. So the Track 2 order just came out in May of this year. And in a sense, you would think that since now we've completed Track 1 and Track 2, we're done. We're not done at all, because you saw the list that came out of Track 1. There's a similar list that comes out of Track 2. And I think more importantly, Track 2 is the regulation and rate-making order. So it's sort of setting the rules of the game for rate cases. It's not, the real change for a given utility is going to happen when their rate plan changes. But it covered a bunch of ground. One thing it covered was utility compensation, and as I was saying earlier, there's this question of how are they going to make money in a future where we're relying heavily on DER. And part of the answer is, to the extent that they are still building infrastructure, the Track 2 order actually affirmed cost of service rate making for that. So the basic traditional approach of setting rates at a level that's meant to allow them to meet their costs and pay their shareholders a rate of return for capital investments, that stays in effect, but for that smaller future system of a high DER future. Complementing that, the Commission also anticipated 2 other new sources of earnings. One are the earnings adjustment mechanisms, which can add up to a maximum of 100 basis points, and they are bumps to the earnings available to shareholders that would otherwise be based on capital investments, except in this case, they are positive incentives for meeting certain outcome-based goals relating to system. Well, they could relate to almost anything, I guess, but they called for the utilities to all initially have them for system efficiency, energy efficiency, customer engagement, improving DER interconnections, and they also talked about having them related to the clean energy standard, and I'll come back to that later. The Commission refers to the earnings adjustment mechanisms as a bridge to a more market-based future. They don't talk about ever winding them down at a given point, but that they seem to be thinking about having them succeeded by platform service revenues, which are also called PSRs. Platform service revenues are all new forms of utility revenues associated with operation or facilitation of distribution level markets. And that, I think, is more what the Commission is hoping the future looks like. But right now, to my knowledge, there aren't any yet in any utility service territories. There was one proposed in the Con Ed rate case that I can think of, and it didn't make it into the settlement agreement. I only follow Con Ed rate cases because, again, it's more than half the load in the state. They're very labor intensive. We're working on the generic proceedings as well. But I did check in with a colleague who's more involved in other parts of the state, and she was unaware of any also. The Track 2 order also talked about capital costs, and I'm just going to talk for a minute about clawback reform. I'm going to assume that people don't know what clawback is, or at least some people may know what clawback is, but some people might not. Traditionally, what happens is in a rate case, the utility will name, will describe a capital improvement that's needed. If it's approved, then the costs associated with that get baked into rates immediately. If subsequently the utility doesn't build it or builds it for less than was anticipated, the way the clawback works is that they actually have to give back the earnings that they got through the rates during that period. When they come to their next rate case, it gets fixed so that they're taking that back. And this probably made a great deal of sense at a time that they were trying to grow the system, maybe really big, maybe even oversize it to accommodate future growth. And it also makes sense if you have a big concern about utilities overstating costs and then, just profiting from the fact that it wasn't as high as you thought, as they said they thought it would be, or neglecting the work, getting something approved and then not doing it in full. But it creates some pretty clear problems in a situation where what you actually want the utility to do is build less system. If they've contemplated that they want to do a distribution system upgrade, you then want them to think about relying on DERs instead. This would appear to punish them if they find a DER solution and rely on that instead. So the outcome in the Track 2 order was that in those situations where, not when they've just not spent all the money, but where they've not spent all the money because they went for a DER solution, they can actually retain the earnings until the new rate case, at which point there would be a reset. Operating expenditures associated with the DERs would then get baked into rates. And they're going to be considering ways to get the benefit from that decision to last into the next rate plan, but they're not there yet. And tariff design. So tariff design is pretty essential because the rates are the centerpiece of utility business plan. That's how they make their money. And as a general matter, the rates are designed so that they can make, as I said earlier, they can make back the cost of their capital investments and meet their other costs as well, plus an increment of profit for their shareholders. And this would seem to neglect part of what one hopes that regulation of a monopoly utility would do. I'm going to read you a quote from Alfred Kahn. I mentioned him earlier. He's a former, he was at one point the chair of our Public Service Commission. He's an economist. He stated that the single most widely accepted rule for governance of the regulated industries is to regulate them in such a way as to produce the same results as would be produced by effective competition if it were possible. And of course it's not possible by definition in a monopoly situation. But if you think about the way competitive pricing works, it allows a seller to make money. It also tells a buyer how much to buy and how much is efficient to buy and when to buy it. And one of the problems with utility pricing as we know it is that it's really not doing that second thing. So the Track 2 order anticipated some pretty significant changes to this, although it didn't make any of them effective immediately. It directed that in future rate cases, a closer look should be taken at commercial and industrial rates to look at making them more responsive to peaks. And in the mass market customer area, they want to talk about smart home rates, which are special price schemes that would be applicable to early adopters of home energy management technologies of various sorts. And if you think about how they would actually do that without the AMI being in place, it's a bit of a puzzle. Should I touch on the fixed cost thing that you asked about earlier, or is that just for the, yeah, okay. And there's we have sort of a big question. One of those sort of $20,000 questions, or whatever you want to call it, probably $20 billion questions, is how generically the utilities will actually even be able to cover their costs in a future where we actually want people to be tamping down demand. Because in the past, utilities fundamentally have made their money mostly on per kilowatt hour sales, even though they're not selling kilowatt hours. As we were talking about, this is a restructured state. They don't sell energy. Energy is measured in kilowatt hours, and yet the rates are largely expressed in kilowatt hours for mass market customers. So if you use a certain amount of energy, your bill is typically going to track that, and that's not that closely related to your role in driving system costs. And it looks like, based on what we've heard staff saying in various contexts, that they are really coming around to a view that's pretty similar to what our economists think, or what my economist colleagues in New York think, which is that demand charges, which are charges for sort of how much, what is the rate of consumption during at the point when you are consuming the most energy. The demand charges, specifically for your contribution to the peak period, should actually be a major driver of what people are paying. And yes?
Demand charges traditionally in Texas have been for commercial and industrial customers. Are you talking about?
I am talking about mass market, yeah. And that would be totally new in New York. But we do think that that's what the staff seems to be favoring, and we think it's what Con Edison is favoring, because it seems to be what their AMI business plan contemplates the upcoming rate pilots are likely to cover. The question is whether they will be able to make them time sensitive enough and frankly geographically sensitive. That's, you don't want to punish people for where they live, but the peak from the distribution system standpoint really varies depending on where in the network people are. It's in residential neighborhoods in particular, it's very likely to be different from when the statewide wholesale peak occurs. There's a better coincidence of the wholesale peak and the distribution system peak in the case of commercial customers. So obviously where the rubber hits the road, haha. Rate cases, I'm not going to actually talk about them in any detail except to say that, as I said earlier, REV is sort of a meta proceeding. It directs a lot of other things to happen, but it doesn't have that much direct effect on anyone's business plan until you get to the rate case. I can tell you that in the Con Ed rate case, for which there's now a settlement proposal on the table, and it's, hearings on that start next week, really a lot of REV concepts made it into that. But we can talk about how during Q&A if people want to hear about that. The last thing that I want to make sure to cover is the relationship between REV and the environment. And it's actually more ambiguous than one would think because DER, everyone have a widespread reputation of basically DER is code for solar. Rooftop solar and storage, it's wonderful, and that's what a high DER future looks like. But it's not as straightforward as that because nationwide, but certainly in New York, that's not what the predominant DERs have been. We have a huge amount of distributed combustion in New York City, huge amount. And in fact, you saw the earlier slide, our hero, NYU with their wonderful plant. That is a combined heat and power plant. But in addition to combined heat and power running on natural gas, which achieves certain efficiencies, we have a lot of diesel backup generation throughout the city. Bless you. And one can imagine a situation where you'd look at a situation like BQDM, and if you weren't very conscious of how to deal with it, an inexpensive local solution might be to put a lot of diesel generators in and run them when you have those critical peaks are coming. But if you did that, you would have a potential for new pollution hotspots, specifically in heavily populated areas, which is where you're going to need the load relief. So the public health impact of those new pollution hotspots could be really terrible. Additionally, any carbon emissions from these from local distributed generation that's producing carbon are potentially very problematic if they start to become substantial because the existing frameworks for dealing with carbon emissions, to the extent there are any, are all about large resources. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, 25 megawatts and above. That's who's bearing a cost of carbon. The Clean Power Plan, the EPA's program, is also concerned with the emissions from large resources. So even if they're relatively clean in terms of their hazardous emissions, if we suddenly are producing a lot of greenhouse gases from combustion downstate, even if we're not getting new pollution hotspots, we could suddenly be undermining RGGI. Those pollutions would be, that pollution would be done for free. You could pollute for free, and that would undermine the RGGI marketplace itself by pushing the allowance prices down. Yes?
Are you taking into account like heating oil deliveries and that type of pollution?
No, but because REV, as it stands right now, is strictly an electric side thing. So and we do have, we also have heating oil in New York, and you may be familiar with like the very dirty heating oil issues that we have in New York that's currently in the process of, and actually has mostly been phased out at this point. So most of the generation that isn't all that clean at this point isn't from heating oil, but we actually have heating oil as a backup fuel at a lot of the large generation plants in New York. If you look at like the EPA breakdown of what the various fuel sources are at generation in New York, you'll see a lot of things listed as dual fuel. And those are actually natural gas and heating oil. And in fact, New York, I forget whether the city or the state advocated for this, but basically the Clean Power Plan originally would have tried to get rid of that. And we've actually, the city or the state actually advocated to keep the right to run those things, because the time that you would tend to run those is in the wintertime, when natural gas, we have some pretty serious generation and heating coordination issues. You know, when there's high demand on for natural gas for heating purposes is when they start interrupting the natural gas delivery to the generators and start actually briefly running them on heating oil. So to maintain electric reliability in the wintertime, they wanted to continue running on heating oil. But for the most part, I'm not taking account of that. It doesn't run very much.
Why is it that the natural gas deliveries slow down? What happens?
Too much demand, not enough pipeline, basically. And actually, it's a problem in New York. In fact, we saw some pretty crazy things happen with in the various polar vortexes where it's gotten super cold over the last few years. It's more of a problem, I understand, in New England for reasons that I don't fully understand. So carbon emissions were a stated goal of the REV proceeding from day zero. I think carbon is mentioned even in that 2013 order, but certainly it was mentioned in the 2014 original proposal. But nobody knew what they meant. There was no greenhouse gas goal for the industry, and it didn't have a clear linkage with anything that was actually happening in REV. It was sort of dangling there. And that's really changed in the last year or so. In 2015, June 2015, our state came out with a state energy plan that did establish pretty robust energy efficiency, carbon, and renewable generation goals for 2030. Even so, the linkage with REV still wasn't all that clear, but that's starting to get better. The Clean Energy Standard proceeding, which is a different proceeding that happened this year, I think I mentioned it earlier as the other EAM. So the Clean Energy Standard is the proceeding that the Commission started at the Governor's directive to make sure that the renewables goal of 50% renewable generation by 2030 actually happened, and with a second, completely separate goal of providing support to at-risk nuclear facilities so that the zero carbon power from those facilities doesn't get lost in the meantime. And the CES came into effect, or rather was issued on August 1st, and what Track 2 contemplated was that within 90 days thereafter, which would be, literally within the next few days, staff should start a process to develop EAMs for how the utilities are supporting the achievement of the Clean Energy Standard goals. So there's starting to be this linkage between carbon emissions and the actual utilities business plan, that the business model, that they could actually make money by supporting renewable integration and carbon reductions, even though they don't own the renewable generation or any generation. The other thing where we're seeing sort of more meat on the bone of caring about carbon reductions, of course, is the decision in the benefit cost analysis framework to go with the social cost of carbon as the real cost of an avoided ton of carbon. There's also the question that's been dangling since the original staff proposal back in April 2014 of how to monetize externalities. There's a separate proceeding that started last December called the DER Valuation proceeding that's sort of supposed to be developing kind of a net metering successor in the short term, and in the longer term, a more comprehensive distributed energy resource valuation or compensation approach. And I can't yet tell you what the proposal for that looks like because it came out at about 3:30 p.m. here, local time, so today. But in the collaborative process that we were participating in, again, they're really looking very seriously at the social cost of carbon as how to, as one of the sources of value of at least distributed energy resources that are zero carbon. One of the things that we kept raising is what about the ones that are not zero carbon? So I'm curious to see what this proposal says. And This is the last point I'm going to cover, which is what happens to energy efficiency in REV. And this has been, for advocates whose focus is energy efficiency, this has actually been this huge existential issue. You know, I quoted to you earlier from the EAPS order, the Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard Order from late 2013. And that was part of this effort to scale down all of these surcharges that were previously funding energy efficiency. And they did. They scaled them down and they didn't replace them immediately. And that has given rise to a lot of angst. You know, do they mean it? This is this incredibly cheap source of carbon reductions. How is it going to happen? And here I will talk for a moment about the Con Ed rate case because I think it illustrates sort of how these pieces come together. What ultimately has happened in the proposal that's now being considered is that new funding for energy efficiency actually is being provided, but it's baked into the base rates. So again, it's not a surcharge, it's part of their actual business plan. There are very aggressive energy efficiency and actually peak reduction EAMs applicable to utility programs that Con Ed is operating. And there's also other EAMs that are still under development. They're being developed in a collaborative process, and there's supposed to be a filing next week with what they're actually going to do. But the settlement agreement agrees that they will establish EAMs for energy intensity and system efficiency outcomes separate and apart, delinked from utility programs. So just literally energy efficiency service territory wide, energy intensity rather, service territory wide. If it goes down, whether or not a linkage with a particular utility program can be established, that's something for which Con Ed potentially could see an increase in their earnings to shareholders. So again, really linking the underlying business model with fostering the kind of environment that the regulators want to see in the future. And with that, I'm ready to take questions, and you have your hand up. But no.
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah, how you doing? What is New York's potential for large-scale wind energy, building wind farms, maybe upstate New York, whatnot?
So large-scale wind isn't something that I work on directly, but the place where I understand that actually our Atlantic coast off of Long Island is potentially the best wind resource on the eastern seaboard. There's also at some point been talk of offshore wind in the Great Lakes at the other end of the state. I haven't heard much about that lately, but there is this plan underway finally being spearheaded by NYSERDA. I mentioned NYSERDA before and I don't think I said who that was. That's another state entity, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And they are developing sort of a wind master plan that I think is focused on that Atlantic coast off the side of Long Island. And apparently it's a very, very exciting resource. And it's also kind of New York City's really only significant opportunity to have nearby large-scale renewables, right? And that's important both because, Con Ed shareholders are going to be helping to pay for these resources one way or another. Con Ed customers, rather, are going to help pay for these resources one way or another. It would be nice to have some of the development in our own region. Additionally, for reliability reasons, we are required to have a certain amount of our, because New York is a, what do they call it, a transmission pocket? What's the word? A load pocket. It's hard to get energy into New York City. And so having resources downstate is actually really important. Most of the generation resources are upstate, but we actually need to be able to serve something like 80% of our total load with downstate resources that are not stuck in that bottleneck. So developing that offshore wind resource could be one of the few ways that we could actually do renewables development in a way that was consistent with that need.
Over here. Is there any active collaboration between what you're discovering and developing and the rest of the grid? I mean, are you sharing? And what organization do you do that through?
So when you say the rest of the grid, do you mean the rest of the country or do you mean the transmission side?
Say you're part of the FERC. I can't remember its name.
Oh, sure, sure. NISO, the New York ISO, that's,
Beyond that, even larger.
oh, the Eastern Interconnection? Oh, okay. Is there a connection? I'm not sure. I mean, we're certainly, there's a lot of sharing going on. But there was that, the Eastern Interconnect had this massive planning process like a few years ago when they were really planning for the future of the grid. And they produced some kind of a plan and then sort of stopped. I don't think anyone interconnection-wide is working on that right now. There is sort of an all eyes on REV thing, and throughout the East and frankly throughout the country, our regulators are talking throughout the region. There's a lot of ongoing work with the rest of the RGGI states on the carbon and renewables fronts. So that's a very, very active ongoing thing. But ultimately, REV, specifically REV, is a public service commission, a single public service commission docket. So they really can't do anything that's outside, their narrow jurisdiction in New York. But there's quite a lot of sharing happening.
All right, thank you very much. You had mentioned earlier how your economist colleagues had been recommending a residential demand charge approach. I was just curious, is there a reason that they were thinking going that way versus TOU or DSO RTP or demand response type of activities?
Yes. Yeah, it's sort of when they think in terms of first principles. If you're going to be charging based on the kilowatt hour, definitely TOU or time variant pricing that's more granular than TOU. And they are talking about time variant pricing, but when you think about what the drivers are of specifically the distribution system costs, the per kilowatt hours consumption just isn't what drives that. You could have very, very high per kilowatt hour consumption and not be much of a contributor to those costs, or low depending on the time. The better proxy is sort of how much bandwidth is sort of a good analogy, I think, for capacity. How much are you going to need at once? And that's what a demand charge, as I understand it, really captures. But I should specify that that's for the delivery rates, right? So we are restructured. That's not anyone's recommendation for the commodity side. And I didn't talk much about the commodity side, but I think making that time sensitive sooner rather than later, and that presumably would be kilowatt hour based, is very important to our economists and is one of the things that they suggested in the Track 2 order. But they don't regulate the generation prices because because we're restructured. The generation prices are what they are, and they get kind of passed through. So, sure.
There is a direct connection from Linden, New Jersey over to New York City. There's a power plant there, and there's been discussion about a second interconnect. Can you bring us up to speed about bringing power in from across the Hudson River?
I'm sorry, I actually can't. I know that connection exists, but I don't know any of the details of a further interconnection. Yeah, sorry. If you're able to answer that, please do.
Yeah, everything you've mentioned so far has been at the state level, and is there any federal input that has helped or hindered? Or is there any federal input you would like to see in the planning process?
That's a really, really good and important point. There is definitely a jurisdictional kind of puzzle to be solved here. There's a lot of talk in all the orders about the need to coordinate with the New York ISO. And I actually think that there is a very serious effort going on to coordinate with the New York ISO. And the New York ISO is starting to think for itself about the social cost of carbon and whether there are things that they should be doing to internalize beyond what RGGI is doing, et cetera. So New York ISO is definitely an important player here. I think that it's taken shape, though, kind of as a jurisdictional battle, because a lot of what I think there's a big fear of, I think they call it buy-side mitigation, where basically there's currently the rule is that if you have resources that have received some kind of subsidy because of a state program, that when they bid into the wholesale market, should they have occasion to do so, they can't bid at the price that they might want to bid at. There's sort of a floor that has to be set that accounts for the fact that they got state subsidies. And that was really developed for different situations, like, state subsidized natural gas plants that might actually be there for the purpose of interfering with the operation of the wholesale market. But when you have distributed resources whose primary purpose and the reason that they got state subsidies was to deal with the local distribution system problem, but they also have the ability to meet certain needs in the wholesale market and they'd like to play there, there's a perception that if buy-side mitigation applies the way it's currently expected to apply, that it will really limit the utility, the usefulness of those resources. So there's a bit of a war going on. War is too strong a word, but there's definitely a bit of a disagreement going on.
I certainly support the unbundling of the retail rates to move out of a volumetric charge, all the things that are fixed costs. But what you get left with is an energy price that's a third maybe of what current retail prices are, and without a significant carbon tax that's going to kill all the energy efficiency. It's going to kill all of people putting solar on their roof. It's going to kill all that stuff because it just don't make sense at the true underlying wholesale energy price. So have you thought about how that whole ecosystem
Yeah,
is fit together?
we have, and here I'm pretty deferential or somewhat deferential to our economists on this, but they're of the view that if you have structured your demand charge properly, meaning that you've structured it around the peak, et cetera, that the demand charge itself would provide a very strong incentive for energy efficiency, because energy efficiency would allow you to bring down your demand charge. So there's sort of this, so it's not that you would be relying on that low unbundled energy price per kilowatt hour, but rather that you would be relying on, in part, on the combination of that and the demand charge. And there may be some things for which a per kilowatt hour charge actually does make sense on the distribution system. But the idea that the per kilowatt hour prices are, the only way to drive things like the efficiency is something that they pretty strongly disagree with. They think that there's a lot of opportunity to use, if your insulation is really great and your efficiency is really great, you've got your lighting right, you're going to see a much, much lower demand charge.
Quick question. So are the markets for downstate and upstate substantially different enough to think about some different factors or different structures for those two markets? I mean, if someone's buying a pickup truck because they need it to tow or whatever, that's a different market than a small commuter car. So in this, what are the thoughts that you've gone through to try to assess that and see if it's worthwhile?
Yeah, you're right. They're very different. They're very different both because we are downstate a load pocket and also because the housing form is so completely different. The fact that we have apartments, that most New Yorkers in the city are apartment dwellers, it's a big issue. And in fact, for a long time, until we started being able to, until we started seeing sort of what it could do on the utility side for things like, bless you, voltage optimization, we had our own hesitation about advanced metering infrastructure for apartment dwellers because they have so little load to manage that the cost effectiveness for managing load, if you only have one major appliance and it's your through-the-wall air conditioner, maybe you just want to slap a smart device on that causes it to not operate too much at a critical peak, and your costs are very low to begin with. They're not going to be able to reduce them that much. Additionally, to give you some sort of, I'm going to be appearing to argue against myself now, but to give you a sense of sort of why the value proposition for AMI is really hazier in New York City. One of the big costs that AMI spares utilities in more traditional or more, conventional land use situations is meter reading. Can be very expensive. There's a lot of driving from building to building to read a single meter, and then you drive to another meter. It is not unusual today for meter reading to be done where somebody walks into the basement of an apartment building And even if all the apartments are separately metered, which they sometimes are, they can sit there with a clipboard and read, 200 meters for the 200 apartments in the building, and then walk next door. So actually, we're used to everything's more expensive in New York City. Meter reading is cheaper in New York City. Most of us are never going to charge an electric car in our garage because we don't have a garage, and we in all likelihood don't have a car, but if we do, it's parked on the street. Most of us are not in a position to put solar panels on our own roof, so we can't optimize the solar panels using advanced metering infrastructure because we don't own our roof either. So those are real issues, and we do need to take a look at I wouldn't expect that the actual products and packaging that emerge in our service territory actually are going to look that much like the rest of the state for precisely that reason. But it turned out actually that the benefit cost analysis for even our service territory, given today's metering costs, which are lower than they were, was very positive even before anyone started thinking about the cost of carbon. And our commission doesn't think they made a mistake by not going with AMI when everybody else did. They feel like they did it exactly right. They let everyone else do it. They let everyone else do the learning curve. They watched the prices of the metering come down. And then, Con Ed, when it approaches vendors, is, very much an 800-pound gorilla. And so, they apparently did really great with striking deals to get AMI. So, at this point in time, and, with the negative learnings from earlier, that seems to work. But I think the same question that applies to AMI applies to a lot of other things. And community distributed generation, for example, which isn't really directly a REV issue, but is certainly a REV-related issue, I think is far more important for residents in New York City than anywhere else in the state, because again, don't have our own rooftops, can't control our own rooftops. So, yes.
So on a similar note to that last question, you spoke earlier about how one of the exceptions to utilities not being able to generate DER is in certain low-income or medium-income areas. I'm curious as to what the details of that program are, how the utilities are able to identify what those areas are, and if there's a substantial difference between how it's implemented in urban versus rural regions.
So I'm not actually able to give you that much detail on that, I'm sorry. I think there actually has continued to be very little utility DER ownership, even under those various exceptions. Shortly after the BQDM order came down, Con Ed actually filed a request for reconsideration. They wanted some broader exceptions, and in particular, they wanted to be able to own DER where the customers wanted them to. Customers who trust the utility more than they trust any other party. They were convinced that to grow that marketplace, they should be able to work directly with those customers. The commission did not give them what they were asking for. And I don't think that those exceptions have become a giant loophole to the utility DER ownership. I could be mistaken. There could be something going on that I'm not aware of. But one thing that wasn't clear when they originally posed the question about owning DER is DER in New York is any, I said it was distributed energy resources, but I didn't really define it because that's not a definition. Distributed energy resources, to the extent it's been defined by these decisions at all, in New York is really anything on the distribution system that modifies your load. So literally insulation in a home is a DER. It's not just generation. And there's obviously nothing in the definition to distinguish a diesel backup generator from insulation from a solar panel. They're all anything that's changing the timing of when your refrigerator does its defrost cycle, which can apparently be a big deal, and it would be nice to do it off-peak. That would be a DER. Stay tuned.
Okay, our time is up. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Appreciate it. And thank all of you for coming, and join us next week to hear Colin. Thank you.